So did you ever change your position once
Yes.
the amendments were added, the Bill of Rights?
It was a difficult determination because myself holding out my vote, Massachusetts was not going to ratify the Constitution. But I told the committee and the rest of the committee that was going through that ratification process, I actually with young Mr. Hancock, I said, go ahead and go away to the committee and tell me how it is going to go. And he came back and he said that we have come to the conclusion about standing for amendments. And I asked how many, and he said the whole. So when he said that, whether he was pulling on my coattails, to a degree I took it that way. But at the same time, I knew that Mr. Hancock and the others were very solid and would push for that. That I agreed, and we went and we voted and ratified the Constitution. Now, did you know how many initial amendments were put forward?
Hundreds.
Yes.
A lot.
Yes. There was over 120 amendments.
Wow.
That were put forward at that first Congress. And then they went back and forth down to the 10.
Wow, 120 down to 10.
Yes. Because some were similar.
Yeah.
In idea and content, and some were clearly identifiable in the context as we understood the intent of the Constitution.
Did you see abuse of federal power before you died happening or growing in the government?
There was a struggle. I mean, General Washington, President Washington had a great struggle on forming this and bringing this all together. The leadership that he brought at that time was great. It was a very deep struggle as to how would that government hold together, first off, because both, I think, himself, myself, and others, we were wondering. I mean, there were times there that even Washington said, if I had known what I see happening here in Congress and that it would be better that America never was born. And to that same idea is that to try and bring this together and not have an abusive government happening at that federal level. It wasn't the administration that was imposing those, as I understand is happening in your time. We were protecting from a king. We understood what that balance of power would be. It was Congress that was doing some of the things and some of the legislation that they were imposing, again, on the states and on the people. It was like, no, you can't, this is not right. And the idea that we had to battle through economic disaster. Our money was no good. No one honored it. Not only the banks wouldn't honor it. We had rebellion going on during those first administrations. I had to take a firm stand against Shays' rebellion in Massachusetts. I was very, very determined, to the extent that I wanted to see the leaders hung. Because I so believed that if we were going to form this federal government, then it should hold true to it, and those that would stand against it, as they did and Shay and those that rebelled, were violating that trust that we were supposed to be building. Although their claim had some justice to it, it was, no, you swore an oath. You took that oath now that you were going to stand for that government which was formed. You fought for it. You wanted it. And now you're rebelling against? it took a very hard line,
Mm-hmm.
and it had to be softened. I spent many years in the legislature, in the Senate, in Massachusetts, not at the federal level, but at the state level. I was very compelled to stay what I believed from that local government. I served several terms after Mr. Hancock, who he and I had a time of disruption in our relationship, but it was healed. And he was governor and I was lieutenant governor, and he passed much as a young man because he was so much younger than myself. And at that point I was appointed governor, and then I was re-elected for 4 more terms. But it was difficult. We had depression, economic depression. We had to come through. The federal government, our banking, there was the bank. And there was a big disturbance between what Mr. Hamilton wanted to do around a national bank versus the independent banking. And see, I had great experience in banking because I didn't talk about my father. I started in that discussion, was that when England was taxing us about the French and Indian War, the banks and ideas of banks were terrible. So at that time, my father began with some of the other gentlemen in the town what was called a land bank, where people would deposit and guarantee their deposit based on the value of their land. And from that we would exchange writs and notes that they could borrow against and others could borrow against. And it was working very well. But Parliament decided that no, that you're not going to take and have this independence in a monetary system. So they came in and shut all of that down. And it almost ruined my father, because he was one of the major stockholders in that land bank and was responsible. And it actually came to a point that after he had passed, they tried to auction our house off, the house that was left to me. But see, that we understood those types of things. There's one thing that I always said, and this is from Ecclesiastes 1:9. There's nothing new under the sun. Nothing new under the sun. If we, and I think it was more of a modern man, so excuse me, but we understood this as well. But I think someone else may have said it differently. If you do not learn from history, if you cannot exchange those stories in truth, because somebody will always come along and try to change that history. That's why when you go back to the time, even from our Teutonic and Celtic heritage, history was precise. History, even in the spoken stories, was precise and handed down from generation to generation. People were selected to be able to communicate that effectively. If you cannot learn from that truth of history, then you will repeat not just the history, but the ills, the evil, the bad portions of it. When I mentioned in there that what we understood in our theological thinking is that we understood the kingdom, and that we were to move the kingdom of God forward. That meant in culture, that meant in politics, in policy, and in law. And to be able to do that and see the kingdom come, that was part of our forward thinking of a theological position, that we were to be that shining city on the hill. You see. But then when the corruption came into the church, and the thinking of the lessness of God and the greaterness of man, which turned into, I think, a belief that you now call humanism. That's as old as Satan himself. Taking God off the throne and putting man on the throne.
In your time, did Harvard started to change direction?
It started after my time. Yes, because we were still sitting in the glory of that first great awakening. So that great, what do you call it now? The revival, I guess, is what you call them. But we called it an awakening, a teaching, just the revelations of God that were there. And that was the expectation, that only governance, good governance, can only come as that continued revelation of God is given. I think I actually wrote something to that effect, and I'm not going to find it at the moment. Our glorious reformers, when they broke through the fetters of superstition, effected more that could be expected from the age so darkened. But they left much to be done by their posterity. They lopped off, indeed, some of the branches of popery. They left the root and stock when they left us under the domination of human systems and decisions, usurping the infallibility which can be attributed to revelation alone. They dethroned one usurper only to raise up another, the king. They refused allegiance to the Pope only to place the civil magistrate on the throne of Christ. Vested with authority to enact laws and inflict penalties in his kingdom. And if we now cast our eyes over the nations of the earth, we shall find that instead of possessing the pure religion of the gospel, they may be divided either into infidels who deny the truth, or politicians who make religion a stalking horse for their ambitions, or professors who walk in the trammels of orthodoxy and are more attentive to traditions and ordinances of men than to the oracles of truth. This was from the speech that I gave about the Declaration of Independence. And much more. But that also brings your earlier question. See, nothing new under the sun. The battles are those eternal battles that will have an end. But you see, we are given dominion over this earth. That's what we believed. There's, I think, that this was a solid belief that we had, that we were given dominion over the earth. We were to reclaim it from the devil and give it back to God for his glory. We're responsible for that. And again, we have to understand his kingdom, not just from the New Testament, but we were students of the Old Testament, because the examples as we understood it of kingdom were well defined within the Old Testament. And that did not change. Christ came as that who fulfilled the sacrifice for our sins. But did he ever say that the rest of the kingdom was diminished? I never studied that in my years at Harvard or understanding our Puritan heritage. That was all part of something that we understood as our Puritan heritage. That we were to move the kingdom forward. That's why my cousin John,
How was he your cousin?
he was my cousin through my father.
Your father's
Brother.
sister or your father's brother?
Yes,
Son of your father's brother.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
Your contemporary, Thomas Jefferson, seemed to be a little bit more liberal in his thinking than you were.
Some people think that.
Well, my only question is, he was really bright, obviously.
Yes.
And he took the Bible and kind of lined out the parts that he liked, and then so he kind of made his own Bible in a way. And then
That's a misnomer.
okay, that's what I heard.
That's a misnomer. Absolutely, yes. And that goes to what is the truth in history
Okay.
versus how people change history. You know what Mr. Jefferson did? Mr. Jefferson did cut out very specifically New Testament truths of Christ's words. You know what he did with those? He bound them into a book. Absolutely true.
Okay.
You know what he did with that?
No.
He put it in his vest pocket, his shirt pocket,
I see.
so he could have the truths of Christ closest to his heart.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's
He
why
couldn't
I-
stick the whole Bible there.
Oh, is that document, the actual original one, still around? Like it's a museum or something like that?
I don't know that.
Oh, okay.
So that was where that story came from.
Yes. He took that. If you go to his writings, and he manifests that truth in his writings. But others, as I understand in your time, have taken that and said, oh no. Mr. Jefferson had some problems. And he had some faith problems. You know why? Because God tested him. The loss of his wife, his love for his wife was phenomenal. And when he lost his wife, it ripped at his heart. You understand? He loved his country. He dedicated his life to that and to education. If there was anything that I would have had as I understand in his elder years, if there was something that I had a discouragement with him about, would be that he brought in some of the professors of Europe into the university in Virginia. So he, thinking that he was going to bring in knowledgeable, solid men, also brought in those that were not solid in their truths.
I know he sought to bring in the most enlightened minds of
Yes.
his generation, which
Yes.
probably would have
Yes.
been those people which...
Yes, we're already from the continent, we're falling away from
Right.
a strong belief in God.
I see.
Oh.
So he
It
was
repeats itself.
probably drawn to their brilliance as whatever they were perceived to be, and took his mind off.
He
the
was
focus
one of the
deal.
most, he and Mr. Franklin were two of the most brilliant minds in the nation of the many.
Yes.
He was very eclectic. You know, when someone talked of Thomas Jefferson, he could speak theology.
Oh,
He could speak science. He could speak politics.
he was an inventor, wasn't
Yes.
he? He did a lot of stuff.
Yes. He was a mechanic. He was an architect. The university was designed by Mr. Jefferson. Mathematician. So he was one of those men that understood, I guess you would call them a Renaissance man, because he had so much knowledge across so many different topics.
Right. How is it that history called you the father of the revolution?
Because I started young. So when I made my thesis and started looking at that idea of liberty, what would it take to foster that in the hearts and minds of the people? What would it take to continually understand from that young age that we needed to separate from England?
Mm-hmm.
It was always on my mind. It was always one of the ideas that I kept planting the seeds into the minds of others.
Pamphlets, education,
Pamphlets.
courses.
Yes. And the times that I spent in the legislature,
Mm-hmm.
and then as we fought against the different taxes that were being imposed and trying to get that overturned, and the communication and letters back to our agent in England, direct letters that were composed that would go to the king.
Mm-hmm.
So bringing that constantly to bear, and then helping to start the committee of correspondence that would facilitate that fire. It was called the firebrand as well, because it would light those flames, feed those sparks to flame across all of the colonies. And so as they reviewed in history the influence to the revolution, there were so many of the fingers of that it gave that birthing from that speech, from my dissertation in 1745.
What was that other piece you wrote? Something about the rights of American colonists?
It was the rights of the English colonist.
The rights of the English colonists, and that
Right.
was in what, the 40s?
The first draft was in the 60s, and then it was again brought forward in 1772.
Okay.
Yes.
And when did you die?
1803.
1803.
Yes.
Wow.
In my last years, I retired at the same time that President Washington retired in 1797.
Mm-hmm.
And from that point forward, I dedicated my life to education.
Mm.
I was always in the schoolroom. The children, it has been said, love to have me there, because I brought that richness of our heritage into that classroom. I was the first one in New England to say that young girls should be educated as young boys, the same level of education. So I knew the importance. And I wrote many letters to many of my friends and to my cousin John over and over, talking about how we had to inculcate into the minds of the youth that of the virtue of the Savior, because without having their religious understanding as part of their whole being, there would be no way that they could stand to all that they would encounter in life. And to have people that could be raised up then as virtuous and moral leaders, they had to have that foundation of those truths that would only come from the gospel.
You think your advocacy for the education of women stemmed a lot from the experience you had with your mom?
I don't know that.
See?
But just the importance that every citizen, to understand for self-governance, needed to have a base understanding of communication, of history, and to advance in mathematics. There was just these fundamentals that I knew that every person should have. You see, again, the Declaration of Independence and everything that I ever wrote about liberty was for every person, because God gave every individual the same rights, regardless of man or woman or race. You see, I have to tell you, my second wife, and both my wives were named Elizabeth, and my second wife, Elizabeth, was of Reverend Checkley's. He was the pastor of the church that I married. And it just so happened, it was just the strangest thing that happened, is that I came home one day, and there was a black woman in our house, and she says, "Oh, look, somebody gave me this slave." I said, "No, not out of my house. There will not be a slave in my house. If that young lady," and she was a young girl, "if she wants to be part of our family, she is welcome." Every individual. That's why it was so important in the Declaration of Independence to recognize the liberty of every human being God created. And I lived what I believed. I lived what I believed.
Can you tell us anything about the Sons of Liberty?
Sure.
I don't really know much about them. I just keep hearing that phrase, and I see plaques, you know, that have the Sons of Liberty on it.
The Sons of Liberty, many would, especially the Tories, would call those radicals, those treasonous people. The Sons of Liberty were the men that would gather, that understood these fundamental principles of self-governance, and were willing to risk at times what it would be required to stand firm on liberty. We had a liberty tree. And when we would call meetings in Boston Commons, and many times it would be to the Liberty Tree. That was the call. Come to the Liberty Tree. And the town would come out. The Sons of Liberty would help those communications. With their fame, I think what came to be was at the time in a December. This was about a December 17th. And there was this tax. All of these, many of the taxes were relinquished except the tax on tea. And we were appealing, and it was different in the different colonies how it was dealt with. We would not allow that tea to land in Boston. New York accepted the tea and put it away. Georgia did the same. Some of the other colonies refused, and their governor allowed the tea to be sent back. This was an issue of commerce again, because the tea could only come from the East Indian Trading Company. So it was an issue of sole sourcing that commodity that we used on a regular basis. And it wasn't that much about the tax, because the tax was only a few pence. So it wasn't an expensive tax. It was the principle that they would tax a commodity that they knew that everybody enjoyed and was well used. And they knew that we could get it also through other sources.
Sure.
But we were being forced to buy from a sole source, and then on top of that, we had to pay a tax to bring it into our port.
A forced monopoly.
Yes, yes. So we appealed when the two ships came in with the tea, and one of the captains was willing to hold off and go off. The other captain was very much, hey, you know what, the governor and the military are going to unload this no matter what I want to do. So we appealed to the governor several times. And on that last appeal, he just said, no, tomorrow morning the tea is going to be offloaded. And the military will ensure that it all is. When we had brought together those men that were willing to stand, again, give their all for liberty, give their all for liberty. And this goes back to, what are you willing to stand for? How much are you willing to stand on your principles? Are you willing to die for it? What are you willing to die for? And the Sons of Liberty were those. So they did. They dressed as Indians. And they threw the tea overboard. And even to the point that in the morning, some went out in rowboats and literally stirred the tea that still would have been floating into the water, so none would be able to land. So these were some of the men, and they were the Sons of Liberty in New York, Sons of Liberty in Philadelphia. So they were those that would be the first to come to the challenge of the Liberty Tree. There were times that I had to quench their enthusiasm because sometimes it got out of hand, almost riotous. There were some riots. You know, it amazes me that we call tolerance tyranny. We call tolerance tyranny. And yet, as I understand, in your time, there is this appeal to tolerance, tolerance, tolerance. We burned the king in effigy. We hung the governor from the Liberty Tree. Some of the things got out of hand, and we had to stop when people tarred and feathered someone because that was excess. We had to stop when some went and did throw rocks into the windows of the governor's mansion, or some Tories trade. He was a tradesman. He was actually a merchant, and we had to stop that crowd from doing that. I just didn't think that that was there were times that we had to show force in numbers, but then there were times when no, you can't. That's not what we were called, or the way that we approach it. But to take and say, look at that person, that is their treason, that is how they're usurping the power, this is what should happen to them. They deserve it because they're violating all laws of God. They're violating the common laws of man. What do you do with them? See, that becomes the balance of what we understand in the scriptures. To love our enemies, but yet to have justice. You have to understand that balance. I did form the Minutemen, and I was responsible for the training of them in Massachusetts. One of the things that I have clearly said, and there's what I clearly said about arms and ownership of arms, every citizen should own arms, not just for their self-protection, but also when called upon to protect their community and their nation. And during this time in particular, I came out very strongly that the citizenry needs to be training in military formation and matters to learn how to be able to defend their community. So the Minutemen definitely, but the people in general. You see, I talk about it even here, is that at some point in time, our youth, as I go over that speech that I gave, is that at some point in time, our posterity, our young, may lose the ideas of the art of war and become so soft in their dispositions that then they are taken over by despotism. So that was something that, not to be predominant, because as my cousin John also says, we are here for this time to study the art of war so that our children can study science.
Right.
They can study literature. They can study the music and the arts. And we wanted that. That's that balance. But yet never forget your foundations at the same time. Have I reached my 15 hours yet?
So, were you almost captured? How did you keep from getting... You must have been a prize to the British and their spies. How did you keep from them capturing you and a few of the other guys and burning your house and your business. How did you get through all that?
Well, they liked the house, so they sacked it, but they used it.
Okay.
Yes. My family had to move out of Boston and
Did
actually
you have to
went
go
towards Main
underground
Street.
at some time?
I was too prominent. There was actually an assassination attempt on my life, but when the troops were in Massachusetts or in Boston, and we were at one of the town hall meetings, and this was at Fauno Hall, that the lieutenant actually had his hand on the pistol ready to shoot, and there was some grace and mercy, and one of the other patriots interdicted for me at that point. So they yes, and I left to go to the Second Continental Congress. And as I was going to that, myself and Mr. Hancock in particular, were going by the way of Lexington and Concord in that direction. We were staying at a good friend's house in Lexington.
Just down from the green.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we were there a week ago.
Mm-hmm. And we were there, and there was guards posted outside. Now, General Gage did, through a series of spies, find out where myself and Mr. Hancock were going to be. At that time, General Gage also had said that the king will pardon all if you return back to being the subjects of the king. He will pardon all except for Samuel Adams and John Hancock. Samuel Adams in particular. So he did send out the troops that night. But there was also, we knew that there were going to be troop movements. And so there was a silversmith in Boston.
All revered.
Yes. Yes. He was, some of his fine works were for people's teeth.
Yeah.
He always laughed and would say, they may not be able to eat, but they surely could talk. But this young gentleman, he volunteered to take and warn the Minutemen, or warn myself, of what that troop movement would be. And so as he understood whether they were going to go by which?
Land or sea.
Yes. Then he took the appropriate course to get there ahead of them. And you may know he was stopped at one point in time. Well, many people understand that the part of the intent was to go, and all of our arms we kept outside of Boston because of the occupation by the military there. And that is another affront to us, was that occupation, because when they quartered and put the troops into our homes, the troops did take and do whatever they wanted to our wives, to our daughters. And that was an evil that came into Boston with the quartering of the troops. So, again, we were in Lexington, myself and Mr. Hancock were in Lexington, and we were asleep, enjoying our rest, and next thing there was a commotion outside. The guards were awoken, pounding on the door, and it was Mr. Revere. And he said, the British are just coming up to the bridge. So Mr. Hancock and I hurriedly got dressed and went across those open grounds to the woods. And as we were making our way through the woods and onto the fields on the other side, we heard that shot. I raised my hands to heaven and looked up and said, thank God it has begun. Because I knew now there was no turning back. You see, that was the shot heard around the world. So when we got back to convention, then we got the full story as it came in as well. But yes, no, General Gage, he actually was sitting down that afternoon and said, "This evening I will dine with Samuel Adams in chains before me."
Mm.
That's
You
how
were on the
confident Gage-
high list that night, the
The high
ammunition
target.
and you guys.
a high list for quite a while. Yes,
It's a high priority target.
yes,
You were on the cards.
yes. And I knew that the penalty for treason, especially going back to England and being tried for treason, was not just hanging.
Yes, what was it? Tell us.
It was to be hung until still alive, then drawn,
And quartered.
not quartered,
Just drawn.
eviscerated first,
Ooh, eviscerated.
and then quartered,
Wow. That's
while still alive.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Much as
I-
I could get in.
I say that many of you in this century have heard of someone we studied, Mr. William Wallace.
Yes.
And somehow or another, his story has been projected on some kind of large ability to see it. And so his end in that story was what was set for myself and Mr. Hancock, and we knew it.
Mm.
So how willing are people to stand on their principles and their beliefs?
Wow.
What faith do they have to stand on the truths that we knew were the gospel, and to be able to then understand liberty for the people? It was also called the Tribune of the people.
Really?
Yes. Because I understood the poor and those that were lacking and were favored amongst them because I would work hard for their benefits. So in the legislation that I would bring forward during the times that I was a committee man or that I was part of the state legislature, they were always on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Wow. So you spent most of the war years in Philadelphia,
Yes.
and there was a few scares where the British would try to come.
Yes. Yes. We had to leave and go and hold committee elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But,
Did your second wife survive you?
yes, she did.
You have any famous relatives today?
I don't know. It was that a grandson was trying to compile, I know, the works and writings, and he passed before he was able to do that. The interesting thing was that many of the writings were so common to those in the household that at one point someone started using some of my writings as
Kindling fire
tender for the fire.
Mm-hmm.
So where of your work that exists, where would it be at?
The works that exist are bound and are part of the libraries and privately held now as well.
Really?
So they're privately
Collectors
held,
have,
and then they're I'm sorry,
some are in private collections.
in
is what
private.
you're saying.
Yes, yes, and a lot have been bound and well preserved. You have a university called Cornell.
Mhm.
You have another one that is in Chicago, and there is an original of that bound that showed up miraculously on the desk of a gentleman by the name of Cleon Skousen.
Ooh, really?
Yes.
Wow.
That is a story unto itself.
All right, who is Cleon? Who is that?
So, if I can move to my 21st century character.
Yeah.
Cleon Skousen wrote the book The Making of America,
Oh.
as well as The Naked Communist, The Naked Capitalist. and
Remember The
many
Naked
other
Communist,
books.
the big red book.
Yes, the Red Book. His son-in-law is a friend of ours, and we've had the privilege of going through much of Dr. Skousen's training on the Constitution.
That's pretty cool.
And this book has just been being rewritten as a student manual.
I need to get the new one too.
Yeah, I can, yeah.
The Making of America.
Making of America is a very good book. It's,
Mm.
I think it just articulates extremely well. Oh, you have it well used. Just the historical founding of the United States. Dr. Skousen, when he, as a young man, he was very liberal from university in California that he went to.
Berkeley or somewhere.
And then he was trying to figure out what he's going to do in life, and he ended up going to D.C. and was doing something, but he ended up as number 2 in the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover on communism.
Ooh.
And
He
so,
studied and researched it all.
yes, and so to write The Naked Communist, he had all of the first-hand documentation that gave him that ability to write all of that.
Hmm.
And The Naked Capitalist is a response to your President Clinton's mentor.
Friedman.
No, he was. He wrote. Oh my goodness gracious! Too many things going through my mind. Quigley. Quigley wrote a very large volume, and you have to forgive me, I can't think of it off the top of my head. I can reference it. It'll come to me. Yeah, 300 years old. But Quigley wrote, studied, being a Fabian socialist, uncovered all of the foundations, the different corporations, the moneyed global people that were intent on destroying America. And he had the freedom to write about it.
Mm.
It was about almost a 2,000-page book. And Dr. Skousen got a hold of it, and as a rebuttal to that book, wrote the Naked Capitalist. Naked Capitalist. Yeah. But that individual was someone that Mr. Clinton was mentored by. And so, but those go into all sorts of other stories as how and why would someone that has the opportunity to understand the foundations of America, its Constitution, its religious heritage, its Christian heritage, not just religion, it's Christian heritage. How is it that they would be so willing to watch it be taken apart? What is the gain? So, think about that in any nation. When it comes to resources in your nation as well. When it comes to the resources, when it comes to watching people get wealth, just as it was with one of your presidents, who was what, a Catholic priest, rose up very strong, was loved by the people, initially did well until corruption started going in. What happened? It was not just the idea of becoming wealthy, it became the idea of power.
Power corrupts, and absolute power
Corrupts absolutely. So when we look at all of the different men, you see the Rothschild family. When I talked about the war, the French and Indian War, well, see, England had its own Bank of England at that time. But the king did not have enough money to pay for that, what was going on the continent with the French War, as well as the French and Indian War in the Americas.
Mm-hmm.
So these international financiers came to the King of England and said, if you give us your banking system, we will loan you this money, and you just need to collect it in taxes and all of that and pay us back. Was it about the money? It was about power. And see, when we look at that, then also, what is it that the enemy of God's creation was all about?
Yeah. If you get power, you get all those.
So see, it's been that battle, and we have the privilege of taking and bringing that kingdom forward. And so our enemy is not just as it is in Ephesians, it's not just, it's the principles and principalities that we war against.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to keep that in mind in everything else that we do. But how does it then affect culture? How does it affect the political system, education, communication, all of that? And so that's the interesting challenge that we have with that. To bring that righteousness and justice to bear. What's interesting is that in the early days of America, very few people really went to prison. They operated under God's laws. If someone offended someone, if you destroyed my hat, even by accident, you didn't go to jail for that.
Just had to replace it.
Yes. And if it was something that was not replaceable, then you had to pay double.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's biblical law.
Yeah.
That's Bible law.
Yeah.
You see? You didn't go to jail. You were responsible.
Mm-hmm.
And you owned up to your responsibility. That's what's expected. That's what we expected would be the truth of justice in America. Not to have prisons full for infractions. There was, again in 1850, he was a Frenchman that wrote a very profound book. It was called The Law.
Ah, I like that book. It's a little white book. Bestiat, what's his first name?
Bastiat.
Bastiat.
Frédéric Bastiat. So yours has got a white cover, mine has a maroon. Depends on who you got it from.
Yeah.
But in that he talks about all of what is fairness in law, what is justice, he even talks about socialism and communism, what he saw. He was one of the economic advisors even to Napoleon. And he saw that corruption and the cry for power and all of those types of things. So, all that's very interesting.
Grapes look very good.
There's also a book called The 5,000 Year Leap, right?
Mm-hmm.
By Skousen.
The 5,000 Year Leap by Cleon Skousen.
Very good.
That talks about the 21 principles of the Constitution. 12, 15.
Hmm?
All of a sudden I can't remember the number.
28.
28, thank you. So 28 principles of the Constitution.
Mm-hmm.
They're principles of life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, yes, that's excellent. 5,000 Year Lead, many others.
What do you think of, I mean, William Bennett and all his Book of Virtues and all that stuff that they write, is that just watered down stuff? He's kind of
I'm again, 21st century guy. I've read the Book of Virtues. I think it's very well done. I think it's a modern attempt, a modern, tolerant, non-offensive attempt to talk about the virtues expected by the founders and its foundation. So I think he did a good job that many people would read and not have their toes stepped on. I mean, you see, our founders were not afraid of stepping on people's toes.
no, because it was black and white.
Yeah, what's truth is truth.
Yeah. It's this way or the highway.
What do you do with that? Truth is truth.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting.
And you guys knew which William Wallace movie he was talking about, right? Braveheart? Mel Gibson?
Braveheart.
No, I didn't know that.
If I may, can I take my jacket
Yes.
off?
No. You come to
The
the
wool
century,
gets
you gotta
warm.
stay 100% in costume.
And there are times I have when it was 115 degrees outside.
Oh, well. Really?
Your wife had to carry you to the car.
Just no, a lot of water.
Yeah.
There was
Stay hydrated.
in the high desert of central Washington, it'll get 115, 120 degrees.
Mm.
He spoke there, and it was